people are arriving, we'll give people a few minutes. I don't know, I was like you guys trying to get in, but I guess the ASA support person didn't open it up. So we should have time, even with this delay, I guess, for around 15-20 minutes per person. And I will keep time. I will show a piece of paper, but you may not see me on your screen. So I may just rudely say, excuse me, you know, at the 5-minute mark. So, and I guess I'll do 20 minutes. And then at the 5-minute mark on 20 minutes, is that okay? And then I'll do like another minute or like at the 2 minutes. We have a lot of people here today, which is great. Looks like we have. So welcome everybody. I think we'll just go ahead and get started. And hello everybody, welcome to the session. And just we can go in the order that we are in on the plan. So we will start with Dr. Elaine Tonto.
Thank you, Shan. Share my screen. Okay, so today, my name is Elaine Tonto, and I'm a business professor at St. George University in New York. And today I'll be presenting the triple day thesis, which is a Marxist feminist capability theory of motherhood. So the structure of the presentation would include the introduction of the triple day thesis, which is a triple day problem and maternal self-reproduction, the capability perspective on motherhood, the Marxist feminist economic perspective on motherhood, and I would conclude with a comment on the integrated Marxist feminist capability theory of motherhood. So the triple day of motherhood is conceptualized as a mother who engages in the reproductive work of childbearing and child rearing, and sometimes in man rearing if a mother is married or lives with a partner. In addition to waged work, which is a double day, but is still able to engage in self-reproductive work, which is a triple day. So I generally conceptualize self-reproductive work as activities that a human being undertakes, and in this case, a mother undertakes to replenish herself physically, medically, or other forms of replenishment that is beneficial to her non-economic well-being. And self-reproduction takes various forms. It includes recreation time, such as time for travel and time for play. It includes healthy living practices, such as time for routine medical checkups, times to heal from injury or illness, time for emotional or mental health counseling, and time for relaxation and good sleep. It also includes forming friendships, having time for friendships, joining associations such as women's self-help groups and reading groups. It also takes the form of the me time. So basically time for basic personal hygienic practices, and also having time to pray, to reflect, and to plan one's own life. The fifth form of self-reproduction includes schooling, which is the more intellectual form of self-reproduction, and it involves the time to engage in academic work or training, and it informs us of a person's desire, and in this case, a mother's desire to learn and acquire knowledge for everyday life, to become an active agent of change within society and for political participation, but also to self-transform into a more marketable intellectual commodity for wage work. So self-reproductive work in the way that I have described are all human flourishing activities. They are all time-intensive activities. Some of them are more energy-intensive than others. Some are more cost-intensive. And some self-reproducing activities are more time, energy, and cost intensive than others. So in defining the triple day, I define it as a combination of one or more of the self-reproducing activities, including sleep hours within a 24-hour day. So the triple day problem would therefore be the lack of freedom or the inability of a mother to engage in self-reproducing activities. And the triple day problem has been described by Donna Genser. I presented my work on a panel at the SCA conference. She has described it as when mothers check on self-reproductive work or self-care due to the lack of time. Within feminist terminology, the triple day problem can be described as part of the crisis of care, which I'll later describe as maternal economic oppression. And within the capabilities framework, the problem could be described as a tragic conflict of care, which I would also talk about as maternal capability suppression. So we move on to the capabilities perspective on the triple day problem of motherhood. And the question that motivates this theoretical inquiry is that if we are to consider each mother as an end and by implication are also interested in whether mothers are free to be able to be and do what they have reason to value, how would the theory of motherhood proceed from within a capability framework to ensure the achievement of such beings and doings? And this capabilities approach provides the ethical framework within which motherhood can be theorized or analyzed. So I start off by contextualizing or locating my theory within Martha Nussbaum's capability theory, where she promotes 10 central capabilities that are used to make minimal assessments of social justice for each human. So some of them include the capability of life, bodily health, play, emotions, and practical reason, and also having control over one's material and political environment. So according to Nussbaum, the absence of those 10 central capabilities for women represents the absence of central human functions, the absence of human dignity and human flourishing, the absence of human life itself. And this is what she constitutes as gender or social injustice. So relating the central capabilities to the triple day or the triple day problem, we find that a couple of, or most of the central capabilities such as play, emotion, affiliation, bodily health are themselves self-reproducing opportunities, or they create opportunities for self-reproduction such as recreation, healthy living, and having the me time. Therefore, capability failures within the triple day of motherhood would also constitute social or some form of gender injustice. So the second area of analysis within the capabilities framework is to theorize motherhood as a combined reproductive capability, where we are looking at motherhood mainly as motherhood as aspirational, and the achievement of which those women who have maternal aspirations can have the opportunity to bear children or to have the capability to function as mothers. And if we are thinking of or having the view of maternal aspirations or becoming a mother as being constitutive of a woman's as being constitutive of human flourishing and well-being, then women who have maternal aspirations should, through some form of public policy, be enabled to achieve the reproductive capability of motherhood. And the capabilities that I emphasize within this framework is social, emotional, and biological reproductive capabilities. I also describe motherhood as a capability suppressor, where I conceptualize generally capability suppression as features of a person's present capability that are likely to limit other current or potential capabilities of that person to function, while those same features simultaneously would play a fertile role in promoting the capabilities or functionings of others. So within this framework, we have a dual role where, within motherhood would at the same time be fertile and be suppressive in terms of promoting childhood functionings. So maternal capability suppression would therefore be described as the limitation of a mother's capabilities to function due to the instrumental role of child-rearing that has been made possible by the achieved reproductive capability of motherhood, which is childbearing. Thus, the inability to engage in the triple day of self-reproduction due to maternal capability suppression would explain the triple day problem. How is maternal capability suppression and the triple day problem intensified? It could be intensified by the unequal gender relations within the family as a result of the unequal distribution of the burden of childcare and housework, the undervaluation of reproductive work, which shows up as unequal distribution of opportunities, time, and energy in the home, unfavorable institutions that promote patriarchy, and on the unfavorable environments within capitalist societies, which involves exploitation of mothers' reproductive work of childbearing and child-rearing, and also of waged work. So maternal capability suppression presents as a dual violation because in relation to the internal violation, there is a tension that is inherent in motherhood between the capabilities of the mother and the capabilities of the child. And the external violation really comes about when society fails to address those tensions through appropriate policies that would address maternal capability suppression. Now, to describe the triple day problem within a Marxist feminist economic perspective. So the question that motivates this section is, if the essence of being a mother in capitalist society, on the one hand, embodies the combined social relations of family production and of commodity production, and on the other hand, embodies material indebtedness towards mothers as a result of exploitation of maternal labor, how should the theory of motherhood proceed from within a Marxist feminist framework? And the follow-up question is, so if there is any form of exploitation within motherhood, who should pay the unpaid labor of motherhood? And this is informed by Paddy Quick's question on who should pay the unpaid labor, if any compensation ought to be paid to those who perform care labor. So the first approach or analysis is to make an important distinction between reproductive work and self-reproductive work. And this is what I just talked about at the start of my presentation. So reproductive work, meaning maternal work within this context, would involve the generational replacement and daily reproduction of future workers for capital, which forms the motherhood substructure of capitalist society. And also this reproductive work of motherhood, I would describe as domestic labor, the specific intra-household labor relations between the mother and the child. Self-reproductive work, on the other hand, is reproduction for one's own human flourishing from a capabilities perspective. And this is at the center of my triple day theory. Secondly, I would describe reproductive work as costly labor in terms of the inability of mothers to engage in self-reproductive work, because it's costly because traditionally maternal labor is unpaid. It is costly labor in terms of the necessary time and effort that goes into the activities at the home that produce and reproduce the ultimate source of value, which is wage labor. And the lack of compensation for such costs to mothers is exploitative and oppressive. And I use Foley's Marxian model, economic model for socially necessary non-wage labor to describe this form of exploitation. In the graph, we have two types of labor, non-wage labor and wage labor, where motherhood labor, maternal labor would represent, where the red arrow is, socially necessary labor that is unpaid. And this is different from unpaid wage labor. That is exploitation that goes on within wage labor. So from figure 1, 3 conclusions can be deduced. One is that maternal economic oppression could be conceptualized as the exploitation of the socially necessary non-wage labor of motherhood within capitalist commodity production, while such labor is wholly unpaid, undervalued, and its cost uncompensated for. The second conclusion is to locate maternal economic oppression in women's role as mothers whose children constitute the exploitable producers of capitalist society, because socially necessary non-wage labor of motherhood is exploited as part of socially necessary wage labor. How is maternal economic oppression intensified? The intensification of maternal economic oppression and expansion of surplus value occurs when a mother who already furnishes socially necessary non-wage maternal labor within the single day becomes a double day mother. And the intensification is visible as a double exploitation of a mother's wage labor and of her socially necessary non-wage maternal labor. It is visible as low-waged work through the reduction in the value of labor power, the cost of labor power, for example, due to women who are working mothers being employed in poorly paid sectors, private or public, example, childcare or healthcare, could be as a result of gender discrimination, within gender discrimination, racial discrimination, or childbearing itself becoming a positive externality through producing enough workers against capitalist labor demand. This intensification is visible at the lengthening of the working day through overwork triggered by low-waged work. And it's also visible as the squeezing of time and energy through overwork. And it is this squeezing of time that limits mothers' engagement in self-reproductive work. Therefore, the inability of a mother to engage in the triple day due to maternal economic oppression within the single day of reproductive work and its further intensification within the double day explains the triple day problem. So how do we resolve the triple day problem? So the resolution of the triple day problem is what I generally would refer to as the triple day thesis. And the strategy here is a bargain for time strategy so that mothers can engage in self-reproductive work. Within the capabilities framework, I adopt NUSSBAUM'S fair bargain approach of promoting childcare options, private or public. But the issue with childcare options is that there is a discrepancy between the real free time that mothers need versus the perceived free time. And with economic options would provide the income or the means with which mothers can have access to more time to engage in self-reproductive work, but it also has a limitation of time and energy demands of the economic activities they engage in. So they are necessary, but are not sufficient. I make a proposal for motherhood compensation, which would give mothers agency over their time to engage in the triple day. And the case for
Dr. Tonto, just 5 minutes.
Okay. The case for motherhood compensation here is that it becomes a direct and formal recognition and material appreciation of mothers' real contribution to the family and the economy. And it also recognizes the crisis and tensions that such contributions generate that is detrimental to the well-being of mothers. It presents as a sufficient intra-family bargaining for time strategy, which gives mothers the economic means to buy real free time to engage in a triple day, and also provides the economic option not to engage in market work so they can engage in the triple day. So within the Marxist feminist framework, the proposal for motherhood compensation is that, like, who should pay for the unpaid labor of motherhood if we should compensate mothers? And going back to figure 1 from this diagram, because socially non-wage necessary labor is exploited as part of wage labor, any redistribution that ought to occur in favor of mothers in the form of compensation should be from surplus value or capitalist profit. And this would resolve exploitation within the single day of motherhood. It would resolve capability failures within motherhood that are the result of exploitation, and would promote engagement in the triple day. So my conclusion on the integrated Marxist feminist capability theory of motherhood is that in combining the capabilities and the Marxist feminist perspectives, we have a robust Marxist feminist capability framework of liberation in which the removal of maternal economic oppression through motherhood compensation can at the same time remove maternal capability suppression, which then expands the freedom of mothers to engage in self-reproduction within the triple day. And it is this integrated framework that creates a capability feminist consciousness to the barriers against full justice, social and economic, for mothers within capitalist society. End of presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tonto. That was amazing. I look forward to the discussion. So next we will have Drs. Catherine Moose and Noe Weiner. Do you want to share?
Okay, I actually can't start. Yes, there we go. So I'm also Elaine's discussant, and I have a few. Should I talk about that now? I can't hear. Cheyenne, you're muted.
We'll do our presentations first, and then we'll have discussion. Okay. Sorry.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I am Catherine Moos, and this is Noe Wiener, and we are presenting a classical perspective on the household production in the social division of labor. First, the disclaimer that we don't have a prepared paper, so apologies to our discussant, but we're still very much looking forward to feedback as this is a work in progress. So first, the motivation for this project is that we're really interested in having a better understanding of the economic role of the household from a feminist political economy point of view that will help us advance both social policy and understand some more radical demands that relate to the family. So when we think about liberal or social democratic policies, which we're very much in favor for with regard to social reproduction and care policy, we believe that they're essential and should be expanded, but they don't really challenge the household's socioeconomic role in social reproduction for the most part, nor this question of diversification of tasks, which we'll be talking about at greater length. And then there have been some, the demand to abolish the family has sort of come back in vogue in some Marxist feminist circles. And while we're sort of sympathetic to the idea that the family is really a crucial institution in oppressive capitalist structures, we are problematizing this and concerned that these calls don't really contain a coherent vision for large-scale alternatives to individual households, nor do they really explain the economic or social implications. And we believe that they underestimate and ignore the social coordination problems inherent in meeting society's social reproduction needs. So our research question that we'll be exploring in this presentation is why does household production as a form of diversification persist despite its economic efficiency? So here we have this great poster from the International Women's Day strike a few years ago, which shows this octopus doing all of this care work, different kinds of care work. So we've got childcare and cooking and cleaning, and there's much more that everyone on this panel is responsible probably for a multitude of tasks. And we call this a form of diversification, and we're really trying to understand why is it that households, even if when they also engage in waged work, engage in this diversified form of unpaid work.
And so I'm going to talk briefly about the conceptual basis for our hypothesis about household production. And that has basically two sources. One is the literature on the social division of labor and the place of households in the social division of labor. And then the gender division of labor within the household. And so, broadly speaking, we could say that for the neoclassicals, it's really not surprising that we find diversification of production, because they basically start with this assumption that technologies and tastes are convex, and so they would tend to favor diversification. That they do that for technical reasons, but then it's not really surprising that we find these households who produce a range of tasks because that's most efficient. But what is then surprising is that there is this systematic emergence of trade among those diversified producers. Why would they need to trade in a systematic way if they do everything themselves? As a side note, that also leads to the idea that money is really just a veil over barter, and so is not essential. And we think that's not really satisfactory. And so coming from a classical political economy perspective, we're all familiar with the story about the pin factory, which points to the idea that for classical political economists, there really is pervasive increasing returns to scale. There's benefit of specialization. And this one way of framing that is to say that the technologies that classical political economists assume are non-convex, and that pushes producers to specialize and leads to, and that's important for our argument, leads to strong interdependence among those producers. And trade is no longer incidental. It's in fact central. The other source, conceptual source for our work is this literature on the gender division of labor. And again, here, by contrast, the neoclassical literature here is actually very eager to discuss specialization. As you know, it takes this framework basically from international trade to say that there's large efficiency gains to be had if each individual within the household actually very much specializes. The problem there, of course, is that it takes the productivities and preferences of the household members as given. In other words, it does not problematize gender norms and does not consider that those productivities tastes are themselves shaped by a history of social interactions. As a consequence, the gender division of labor is considered natural and in fact efficiency creating. And the critique to that is of course from the feminist literature, where the gender division of labor is in fact a main source of women's oppression on the one hand, exploitation within the labor market and oppression within the home from that gender division of labor. And there's of course a huge ongoing debate on this issue, but basically the gender division of labor is considered not natural and in fact socially constructed. The main inspiration for our work actually comes from this paper by Foley from 2020, which discusses a number of ideas really, but that arise from applying the idea of social interactions models and information theory to classical political economy. He looks at social coordination problems in Marxian political economy, as an example, the falling rate of profit, where basically the self-interested, uncoordinated behavior of agents leads to a suboptimal outcome. Also discusses instability of some institutional arrangements such as barter. And what we really take inspiration from is this model of what he calls here the hub and spoke model that you see on the right-hand side, where we have various specializations at the spokes of the wheel. And then in the hub of the wheel, we have diversified production. And that's where we would locate household production, is at the hub of this wheel. But what that means is that this is in some ways a mixed strategy, to use game theory language, of the specialized pure strategies of going into one of these spokes and working there. And it's also a non-coordinated outcome. So it is a suboptimal outcome to be at that diversified hub. And this was the inspiration for us to say that we view household production as a form of diversification, and in fact as a defection, so to speak, from this social division of labor. From that perspective, it's really a puzzle to think about why household production persists if it's in fact economically inefficient. We think the question leads us to ask, who benefits from the persistence of this? And what are the social coordination problems that prevent households from achieving a coordinated, specialized solution?
And so our, taking inspiration from this paper, our intervention is to put care work into the hub and spoke world and to really take care work seriously and all of the particularities of indirect and direct care work, of which there's a vast literature in the care work literature. So by indirect care work, we're talking about types of household production and care where the relationship between the caregiver and the care receiver are less crucial. So you could think of something like laundry, perhaps. And here, things like there are efficiencies and returns to scale that relate to technology. When we look at direct care work, things get a little bit trickier. This is where the relationship between the caregiver and the care receiver is really, really important. And so while this type of care work can be made more efficient and effective when there's specialization, especially when those specializing acquire expertise and experience. You could think of things like trained nurses or childcare providers who've studied early child care development. But there's also some limits to the economies of scale and how efficient direct care work can be without sacrificing quality. So you can think about regulations around how many young children can be under one caregiver's care in a daycare, or in our home state of Massachusetts, there's some political action around safe patient limits with nurses, how many patients can be assigned to a nurse, because there can be some really dire consequences. And of course, there's a vast literature also on care workers having reduced bargaining power due to the characteristics of care work, and also of the multiple market failures in the provision of care work.
And what we've developed so far is a basic taxonomy of what you could call modes. Sackham calls the modes of reproduction, no, subsistence. Yeah. We sort of try to layer on various layers of abstraction to try to understand where this push towards diversification might come from. And so one sort of mode of subsistence we discuss is on the extreme end of diversification is what we call homesteading, where you have basically no systematic exchange with other households. All production of those homesteads occurs for own consumption. That means, of course, that to meet your own consumption needs by yourself, you really do need to diversify across all your consumption needs. I think this points to a considerable time and effort that is spent on that. It limits, of course, by definition, productivity gains. It limits, from the point of view of social reproduction, it limits the ability to recuperate, and to pursue education and learning. So there's a kind of negative feedback loop that traps households in a low productivity state. On the other hand of specialization, we could have what Foley calls in his paper the spontaneous socialist case, where each household is now, in fact, at the spoke, so is specialized in one form of production, including socially reproductive services, might be various types of specialization. This, in some ways, fully exploits the gains from specialization, but it raises problems to do with the stability of this arrangement, because of course, if a household can receive a share of the social product, but still diversify, they can increase their production, right? So if they continue to provide a range of social reproductive services in the household for themselves, they can increase production. So that points to a kind of instability of this spontaneous socialism. And this goes beyond what people have talked about, which are, monitoring problems, shirking problems of socialist economies. Of course, there would still be gendered disadvantage for the households that do specialize in social reproductive services that one would need to consider. The point is, there would be a need for enforcement mechanisms such as social norms, and these are not necessarily automatically emerging. In between, we have what you might call a commodity economy. So now we have households that produce commodities, including social reproductive services, for sale on the market. And the question is what changes by introduction of the commodity economy? One thing is that it now opens up the possibility for a divergence between private and social demand for those goods. It's not yet clear in which direction this points, but it opens up that divergence. It also opened up the possibility that there is going to be a deficiency of effective demand for the care work provided, because those who need the care work, children, the elderly, do not necessarily earn an income. We think, this is very early thinking on this, but given what we believe from classical political economy, the free mobility of producers across these specializations is going to lead to prices that are proportional to labor time. And since there's limits to productivity gains from specialization in social reproduction, these commodities would tend to get relatively more expensive. So there emerges a need to probably diversify to some extent for those households to increase consumption of social reproductive services. So there's some realization of the productivity gains, but not full specialization. And looking more closely at this market exchange, we now consider what are, can you look at the time? What are, is the effect of patriarchal and capitalist institutions as they get layered to that successively. Thanks, Rayan. So looking first at patriarchal institutions, basically what is the effect of having men that, for example, can capture the residual produced by the household because of their power in the household, the persistence of social norms and so on. So far, we've looked here at Folber and Brownstein's 2001 paper, which basically argues that for those husbands in those families, they have an interest to limit their wives outside fallback options, and so push them towards, basically from our point of view, excessively diversify in household production, because it will increase their relative male consumption, even though it's actually in their framework, it's a reduction of efficiency for the household itself. So this would be one push towards diversification. Something similar we think would happen as you now consider a class divided capitalist society of market exchange. Here, nearly all households will need to supplement their paid work with unpaid household labor, because of course now, as Elaine already talked about, right, capitalists capture the surplus and there is less available for social reproductive services. Here now, in terms of the separation between public and private benefits, we think there's a systematic tendency now for the public benefits to exceed the private benefits, because of course, you know, employers benefit from the generation of the labor force.
And so bringing this all back together, what does this tell us about the household as an economic institution? So we're arguing that that market exchange, even in the absence of patriarchal or capitalist institutions, has a tendency towards diversification due to the market failures related to the particularities of care work. Patriarchal exploitation further incentivizes diversification as men are able to benefit from women's unpaid labor. And then capitalist exploitation further incentivizes diversification because workers cannot meet their socially reproductive needs with only their wages. And so together, if we're going to describe a mode of subsistence more similar to the one we're living under, patriarchal and capitalist institutions create self-reinforcing feedback loop through diversification, through the combination of these institutions. And then finally, sort of our bigger goal is to argue for democratic control over social reproduction, which we believe would require a multi-pronged approach to undo the distortions of commodity social reproduction, undo capitalist oppression and the push towards diversification, undo patriarchal oppression for the similar reasons. And this would entail new forms of social reproduction, which would internalize some of the social and ecological externalities, but also require a great deal of experimentation. But this would also, as Noé alluded to earlier, require new agreements on an enforcement mechanism, on social norms and surveillance. And we'd have to think really carefully about how this could be done in a way that was just and how this could be done in a way that was emancipatory. And finally, these are some photos of us engaging in diversified household production. So thank you for your time and attention. We look forward to your feedback.
Thanks to both of you. I'm really looking forward to that discussion as well. Next, we'll have Patty Quick. Do you have your slides?
Let me try. How do I get my screen on?
You just select share screen at the bottom.
Oh yeah, okay. Gotcha. Oh, fuck, excuse me.
Patty, you may want to go off screen until you find it.
I know, I'm just getting my,
Okay.
okay. Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, so thank you. I really appreciate being part of this panel and learning from my other presenters, and see if some of what I can do can contribute to some of this. So what I'm really looking at is the interaction between capitalism and reproduction, social reproduction. So I'm taking as my starting point a couple of the characteristics of Build Back Better proposal. Some of them had, I think, the direct effect to redistribute a small portion of income from capital to labor. Things like a $15 federal minimum wage, 12-month provision of a 12-week provision of family paid family and medical leave, financed by an increase in taxes on capital. But all of these got whittled away until we were really left with one thing that was actually supported, including by some of the most recalcitrant Democrats and Republicans. One component that met with little opposition was the provision of free universal pre-care, or sometimes called education, although mainly it was conceptualized as childcare. Another component, similarly widely supported, was the provision through tax laws of subsidized childcare. Both of these fall into the category of the provision of care and have as one of their goals, an increase in the labor force participation rate of women in particular. There are three components of production involved in the maintenance and generational reproduction of the working class. One is household production, two is the production of state sectors, such as in education and healthcare, and three, the production that corresponds to the monetary earnings of wage laborers that takes the form of wage goods that are either directly consumed or used as inputs into household production. Necessary labor constitutes the three of these together. It is a major mistake. Together they constitute what in Marxist terms is called necessary labor, as I think Nancy Folbray talked about it, as distinct from surplus labor that is appropriated by the capitalist class in the form of surplus value. It is a major mistake to use the term care labor to refer only to the first two of these, and thus to exclude the ways in which people care for their households by engaging in wage labor. An increase in the second component, namely the care provided by the state sector of the economy, has historically served as a substitute for household labor rather than an addition to it. In the capitalist mode of production, the dominant objective is the maximization of profit, or in Marxist terms, surplus value. This requires the maintenance and generational reproduction of the working class, i.e. its reproduction. Maximization of surplus value thus necessitates the minimization of the labor required for this reproduction. The capitalist class and the state that it dominates have no interest at all in providing for the care of the working class beyond this. This is a class struggle. I think I can go back, sorry. The historical reduction in household production. I wish I could get this screen off. How do I get this screen off? Oh, done it, okay. The process of economic development within the capitalist mode of production can be understood as having one of its driving forces the reduction in this total necessary labor, and in particular, the portion that consists of household labor. I make note here that what Adam Smith referred to as the division of labor was not to do with the division of labor within the pin factory, but rather, in fact, the commodification of household production, so that it was illustrated for him by the example of the household coat rather than the pin factory, which involved not national and international in division of labor and the process of commodification. For simplicity, I'm going to look here to assume that all labor takes the form of either household or wage labor. This is then followed. This is the following analysis ignores how the petty commodity production and assumes that all commodity production consists of capitalist commodity production. Reduction in household labor takes two main forms. One is the substitution of commodities for the production of use values by household laborers. These commodities require less labor than the household labor that resulted in their use value. This is what drives the process of commodity production that is accelerated by the development of capitalist commodity production. The second form of reduction in household labor is the substitution of state workers for household workers, thereby reducing again the quantity of labor required for their contribution to the reproduction of the working class. The working class must, however, continue to work full-time in order to survive. The time freed by these two categories of measures will allow for, or to put it differently, necessitate the use of that time as additional wage labor in the continuous challenge that workers face to provide for their reproduction. The effect of these two developments is therefore to increase the proportion of the labor of the working class that takes the form of wage labor, i.e. to increase the labor force participation rate of women in particular. The substitution, when looking at state-provided care, the substitution of the labor of state employees for that of household workers, and in particular the mothers of young children, has been a major feature of capitalist development over the past half century. Between 1975 and 2019, the labor force participation of women with children under the age of 3 increased from 34% to 64%. The labor force participation in 2009 of women with children under the age of 1 was 60%, and 3/4 of them worked full-time, i.e. 34 hours or more per week. We need to put this in perspective when we're talking about the state-provided care. The substitution of the labor of state employees is a form of replacement of household labor by state-provided wage laborers. Would these programs benefit children? While a well-funded childcare program can indeed improve life for children of the age of 2 or so, it is definitely harmful to the health of infants whose mothers are forced to give up breastfeeding because of the pressures of full-time wage labor. The idea of perhaps a 2-year maternity leave is something to consider. 4 weeks is, I'm afraid, ridiculous. Take what we can get, but that is ridiculous. Obviously, not every woman wants to or needs to engage in breastfeeding, but the necessity of wage labor is a different matter. One argument for pre-care and other programs is that an increase in women's labor force participation is itself beneficial and contributes or constitutes the liberation of women. Feminists recognize that gender relations may be improved when women are able to provide a higher proportion of monetary income to their households, although its effect on the level of gendered violence is less certain. There can, however, be no presumption that this constitutes an improvement in the material well-being of the working class, either women, children, or men. Sorry. The assumption that household labor constitutes drudgery and is necessarily degrading to the women who carry it out has a long history. To understand this, it is important between its ruling class and its working class origins. Ruling class or bourgeois feminism, and I use that term not as a term of abuse, but as a historical term. One form of feminism arose from the struggles of working class women whose roles in society was undermined by the growth of capitalist production. They therefore demanded the right to participate in the economic and political activities of their class, and they asserted their moral and intellectual equality with men. This included the demand for the right to education. This is clearly a progressive force. However, the work that they used, the term work, the work that they wished to carry out did not include the substitution of their own activity for that of their servants. That work, along with most of the labor of the working class, was understood to be inherently inferior to the activities of the ruling class in which they wished to participate. Socialist feminism, socialists challenged the belief that it was capitalists who were responsible for the wealth of society, and in place of that, they asserted that it was labor, not capital, that produced this wealth. The assertion, however, took the form of attributing this wealth not to the labor of the working class as a whole, but to wage laborers alone. Household production was simply not considered to be production. Capitalists and socialists alike, including Marx and Marxists, limited their conception of production to that which took a monetary form until this was challenged most effectively by the very recent, historically recent, second wave feminist movement in the last third of the 20th century. Marx indeed, like capitalists and like other economists, did indeed ignore household production. Socialists thus traditionally accepted the characterization of household labor as inherently inferior to that of wage labor, and therefore advocated what they call sometimes the industrialization of household production as the solution to women's oppression. After the Russian Revolution, it was one of the boasts of socialist feminists within Russia that women carried out women were increasingly involved in wage labor. Today, the respect for this category of labor and the women who are disproportionately responsible for it constitutes a rejection of this assumption. The production of a wage labor on a production line operating a cash register or entering data, while increasingly necessary, is understood by most women and by socialist feminists today as involving far less skill and to be of far less importance or less value, watch that word value, than that of household laborers. It is necessary, therefore, to reject the use of women's labor force participation rate relative to that of men as the primary indicator of the status of women, as is currently done in the UNDP Index of Gender Inequality. While they look at the political inequality, their primary indicator for economic inequality is women's labor force participation rate. The allocation of labor government revenue obtained from an increase in taxes on capital to the provision of pre-K child labor and subsidy for childcare expenses must be welcomed, but in order to constitute a permanent increase in the well-being or care of the working class, there must be an increase in the struggle with the capitalist class. Otherwise, the increase in production that results from the substitution of what may well be more efficient childcare will be appropriated by the capitalist class, leaving the working class, as before, reduced only to what is necessary for its reproduction. So the struggle over the allocation of the working class between these three categories of labor has to be situated within the overall class struggle between capital and labor. Without that, it's incapable of understanding the long-term implications of any of the reallocations that might take place. Thank you. I'm off.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Patty. And again, I look forward to discussion after, and we'll have our last presenter, Dr. Alicia Garon. Alicia, you're on mute.
Mute. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we have been. This is a mix between the public policies and the violations of gender that we have had, especially in Mexico and Latin America. But all the data that I am going to use is only from Mexico. And we are trying to see what happened, not only in right now in COVID-19, because violence, women violence is advancing very fast in our countries since maybe 20 or 30 years before the pandemic. So the title of this paper is Women in Post-COVID-19 Times, Pandemic Violence and Social Reproduction in Mexico. So now let me see how I'm going to work this. Okay. So well, I'm going to read how the way I am introducing is that, first of all, feminist struggles have shown violence as the center of the dispute between social reproduction and public policies. Public policies cease to favor the welfare of society as a result of the deregulation and financial liberalization process implemented within the framework of the Washington Consensus. The beginning of the economic reforms, monetary policy focused on taking care of inflation and fiscal policy, reoriented budget limits to the onerous service of institutional investors to the detriment of social spendings. So that result has been a dramatic situation causing a substantial increase in gender violence, and COVID-19 exclaimed and evidenced the lack of functional finance putting social reproduction at stake. So how do we divide we divide first the relationship between social reproduction and violence. Then the second one is the public expenditure on social functions and public debt, the informal employment on paid work and income, and then the violence against women at the country and at home, and the proposal for post-COVID public policies with a gender approach. So first of all, in the scheme of the Sustainable Development Goals, in the 2030 agenda, the 16 goal is peace, justice, and strong institutions. So here, what we are seeing is that violence is related with the implemented public policies of the ideology of austerity and employment sacrifice, and therefore with social reproduction. And so many of you have already, I know very well, the feminist anthem, A Rapist in Your Path, Un Violador en Tu Camino, who the first one, it appears in Chile 2 years ago, points to the state as a rapist of structural changes within economy without considering the respect for life and the role of social reproduction, which is in the hands of women. So gender violence at home, broken down into psychological, physical, economic, and sexual violence, becomes important when related to the country's violence indicator and at the same time with those of the economic cycle. So there is a very close relation between violence and the lack of social reproduction. So one could even argue that violence is a result of the deterioration of the living conditions of the inhabitants in an economic, political, and social formations that evidence the issues women face in confinement since the pandemic started. So what do we mean by social reproduction? Well, I'm not going, everything we have already, especially with, we have already talked about this, is as we understand is biological reproduction, workforce reproduction, but also the conditions that support a social system, political, legal, and ideological, which create that context for economic relations of productions to operate. So this is very important, this chart, because it is how in Mexico, the public expenditure on social functions and security. And I am going to try to, I would like to put maybe this, I am seeing your faces. If we see, for example, how, I'm going to take how education, if you see this is, no, let me see, the red one, education and health. If you see during the last years, at least the last decade, education and health has decreased a lot, and the financial cost of debt has increased a lot. So here is the financial cost of debt. The thing is that we want to explain is how the budget in a country like in Mexico and in most of the countries of Latin America, the cost of debt, the payment for the institutional investors is most of the public budget, and so it decreased the public and health sector. So what we are seeing is when you see social protection, this is especially of the social programs that the governments are having, but at the same time is the military budget that has increased to frenar, to stop the criminalization of our economy. So in the next one, so this is also how the it is the same graphic, but it is we can see the annual growth of rates. I'm going to go faster, so because there are a lot of numbers here, but what we want to what I want to share is how education and health has decreased a lot in front of the cost of the financial cost of the debt. So in the next one, these are data that we were before the pandemic. For example, according to the estimate of Coneval, which is the institution that are specialized in the index of poverty, 109.3 women of every 100 men were living in poverty, and 104.7 women of every 100 men in extreme poverty. This, as we know, this has increased a lot, especially for women, and the extreme poverty during after 2 years of pandemic have increased a lot. So the other thing is the educational gap between women and men, and also the household income inferior to the minimum welfare line, 104.3. And so this is how the access to health services, only 76 women for every 100 men have access, and also housing without basic service are 97.7 women for every 100 men. So now we have let me take the other one. And so how is the employment and the informal employment and unpaid work and the income? If we see here is the economic value of unpaid housework and care work as a percentage of national GDP. And it is the red ones is the unpaid work in the house of, it is very high. It's between 2021 to 22.8. It's variable, but it is very, it's maybe we can say it is between 3 and 4 times more unpaid work between women and men. And so what are the, now let's, this is another graphic what we have the share of the gross value of unpaid work at household between GDP percent, provide care and support is 4.9, provide food 4.9, cleaning and maintenance to the home 3.2, to other households and volunteer work 1.5 for women, provide shopping and home management 1.6, and provide cleaning and care of clothing and footwear 1.4. So this is all the working unpaid hours that women decrease. Then the informal employment is the income for employed women and men. This is in pesos, but this is, you can see how a woman, is the gap between men and women is what's a little big, no? And then we are going to, the next step is the violence against women at the country and at home. And in the society, we divide it in the society and in the couples. But in the society, it is very important that you know that feminicide in Mexico, the rate of feminicide is over Latin America and of course over the welfare average. So we have in against life and bodily integrity, feminicide, intentional homicide, wrongful death, intentional injury, and culpable injury. And then also the crimes against personal freedom. We have kidnapping and child trafficking. And this is very important. And maybe in the next conference, I hope to participate in the next conference of YAFE and in summer YAFE conference, because we are also working human trafficking of the North Triangle countries, where is not right now human trafficking of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and Mexico is increasing a lot for all the people that are migrating or trying to enter USA. Then we have the crimes that threaten sexual freedom and security, especially rape. And of course, there are other rapes, and of course, the violence inside the home. So violence, as I told you, Mexico exceeds Latin America and the world in the number of intentional homicides of women, 5.8 for every 100,000 women, in front 4.4 in Latin America and 2.4 in the world. So 83% of women over 18 years of age perceive insecurity in public transportation and spaces. So that's then this is in the States, trying to see how this was increased during the pandemic. We see you see here how this has been increased. At least it has increased in lot. We don't have 2021 yet, but it has increased. But you can see how in the last 5 years, this has increased almost a double of the feminicides. So, and then what else? And then we have this here, we divided by the states, and one of the states where female victims is higher is Guanajuato, which is in the central part of Mexico, which is a lot of has been increased the feminicides. So, and then we have here all the emerging calls related to incidents of violence against women. This is there's a number, a telephone where you can call when you are having violence at home. And this has increased a lot. If you can see the numbers, for example, is here in 19, as I told you, during the last 5 years, it has increased at least more than 300 times, no? From it was 92, 60, 04, And the last year where we have the numbers is 260,000. So, and then—
Sorry, may I just interrupt real quick? You just have 5 minutes.
Okay, so there are other crimes against women, and well, we have the numbers, but as I see here, this one is well, the extortions of women, the kidnapping, no, the human trafficking, the child trafficking, which is a huge problem, and also the corruption of minors. So I will try to finish. Well, this is the different emotional, economic, and physical and sexual violence. And let me see, this is inside the home. And well, what we would like to say here is that we have to find some proposal for post-COVID public policies with a gender approach. But the most important thing that maybe I would like to let me know that I will stop here, is that one of the most important thing is how all this public policy of austerity in countries like in Mexico, and that the payment to the institutional investors has been reduced public budget in health, education, infrastructure. So when began the COVID almost 2 years ago, when the subsecretary of health said that we have to wash our hands every time, we must ask who has water, who has the water. Even in the urban areas, not everybody has access to water. Maybe you have, no, but not plenty of water to be washing the hands. And they said that you have to pray or to sing a song while you were washing. So this has been terrible for Mexico. And that's why I want to that people that are in this Congress know what's going in Mexico, and also that austerity policies has been a huge damage, not only for the budget, but especially for women, and that we don't have at least a care system that must include many, many things. I stop here because it is very polemic and it's very emotional stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that great presentation as well. So now we will sort of start over with discussant comments, and I encourage our audience to be putting questions into the Q&A, and I will help to moderate those. Again, I think we'll start with people just providing all their comments, and then we'll have some discussion and authors will be able to comment, okay? So we'll start with Noe providing some comments for Elaine. I'm sorry, you're on mute. Can you start over?
Yes. I thought this was a very exciting paper, and you know, combining the capability framework with a Marxist lens. I have some question about that too. In my view, and all the questions I have are questions about clarification, which I think can be resolved. And I had some issues understanding, but I think the paper is on a good way, you know. Sort of at the center of it for me is this discussion of maternal economic oppression as the exploitation of maternal labor. I think you distinguish here between, you know, increasing depth of exploitation, of oppression, which I understand. You talk about the increasing breadth, which is a little unclear to me. It has something to do with the lower wage for mothers' paid work, but then also has something to do with the cheapening of labor power through that, you know, reproductive work at home. So that brings me to the clarification on exploitation as uncompensated. Just need to have the same issue as Patty with seeing. There we go. The problem of exploitation as uncompensated costs. That seems to be how you frame exploitation. The lack of compensation of the taken for granted costs, however varied they may be, by capital is exploitative. I would have liked to see a discussion of how this definition relates to the existing literature on exploitation, which talks about, exploitation as the control of the surplus product by another, or of hours, at the individual level, as hours contributed versus hours embodied in the consumption goods and so on. So how does this view of exploitation relate to those other definitions? In general, a little bit of like this use of the term costs as attached to various things. So you talk about costly labor. I was kind of wondering, isn't all labor costly, because all labor requires effort and involves trade-offs? So, what exactly is added there by talking about costly labor? I also, this is about the issue of self-reproduction, which I really understand. That's we now want to look at the residual beyond the reproductive care for others and beyond paid work. I am not 100% sure I understand what we would lose by lumping all of that together into reproductive work. So reproductive work for others and reproductive work for self, since both are essential, right? Like the labor power of the mother would degrade if she did not engage in self-reproduction. And it is a little confusing to me that it involves these very different things. So things like self-realization, what you mentioned as me time, versus something that enhances the value of one's labor power, training, and so on. And related to that, is there a conceptual difference between the self-reproductive work of mothers and the self-reproductive work of non-mothers? Finally, I also wanted some more clarity on what is gained by bringing the capability framework into the political economy story. You mentioned that it allows you to talk about the mother as an individual. I guess I'm thinking that if you just state at the level of exploitation, couldn't you also consider, individual rates of exploitation that would also allow you to talk about the individual? So those are my main questions, but overall, thank you very much. Very interesting paper.
Thank you very much for those comments. And again, to the audience, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll move on to, I believe, Alicia is discussing Noe and Catherine's paper.
Well, I just read the abstract, and I have just taken some notes while they were explaining their paper. And well, it is very different, but one of what they were explaining, I think that it is very important to see that when we are talking about patriarchal relations of the different roles of gender in the households, I think that we must compare also with other societies. For example, since few time ago, I am involved with African Asian cultures. And for me, it is very difficult to understand why abortion in some African communities are not, they adopt the baby as part of the community, but not as part of the family. And how these are, how they have another vision. And maybe also I have been involved with all this new about decolonization and all that. And I think we have to introduce a little bit more or try to find that when how we can explain what's going in our society, especially in America and in Latin America in the media class, no, how this has been functioned. And another thing that you said that it is very important is all these new how women. Because if you study women in the Japanese society, or a woman in the Soviet Union, especially during or after the war, how women take different roles until societies are stabilized. So woman is not only, I don't know how to say in English, but the Marxist theme, ejército de reserva, the reserve force, no? So woman, it depends in the needs of the development of capitalism, or in the needs of the development problems of the society. But that's the only things that I can say. I think I like a lot the paper. I enjoy it, but maybe it will be very important to say that the objective of this paper is only during this period, and only to see the family in a special society, and that there are also different families, different types of reproduction in other social formación, also in other economic and political social formations. For me, that will be all my comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And Elaine, we have comments for Patty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really enjoyed Elaine's paper.
Patty,
yeah.
It's Elaine is providing comments to you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll be quiet.
So, share slideshow. So I also enjoyed Patty Quick's paper, because I draw most or some of my ideas from her work. And so here we go. So most of my comments are based on the paper that I received. And Patty describes care labor as the labor of those who provide directly for the maintenance of the working class within the household. And care labor would include labor of those employed in both public and private sectors, mainly one category being childcare and the other healthcare and education. And the feminist concern of the paper was that women are disproportionately responsible for childcare work and work in the healthcare and education sectors. And the fact that women employed in these sectors are poorly paid, and that there has existed over the past decades a stagnation of wages, which impacts negatively on women's standard of living and is linked to the oppression of women engaged in care labor. Patty doesn't only talk about that, but she mentions that this stagnation of wages doesn't show a complete picture of the immense stresses that are experienced by the working class, some of which are the inability of the working class to provide for themselves and their children, due to, for example, participating in necessary full-time labor, and that has also resulted in a fall in the birth rates amongst the working class. So I related this to my work in particular, and the comments here is that if we are to promote a view of childbearing as constitutive of a person's well-being, then the well-being of those members of working class families, specifically women who have maternal aspirations or parental aspirations, but are unable to pursue those aspirations due to the ongoing oppression, would be impacted negatively. And this is the reason why, and I agree with Patty Quick, that society through policy needs to address these oppressive tendencies, which are as a result of the process through which surplus value is appropriated within capitalist production. So my question to Patty is, are there other forms of stresses that manifest as a result of the oppression, as a result of engaging in that necessary full-time labor? What are your views on the inability of the working class to perform self-reproductive labor due to engaging in necessary full-time labor versus, for example, only being unable to perform social reproductive labor for their children? In your presentation, you mentioned the case of nursing mothers. This wasn't discussed in the presentation, but in the paper, you also mentioned that the crisis of care labor is not only just centered on oppression of women in general in the care industry, but also on the gendered and racialized forms of such oppression. I found that to be very important in your paper because it addresses the discriminatory nature that oppression within care labor takes on certain genders and races. It does not characterize the crisis of care as one of gender alone, but also of race. And it also addresses the problem of the lack of specificity of the intensity of oppression among different groups of people within the working class. And the question is that, what about the nature of within gender or within race forms of oppression? So for example, amongst women, what would be the nature of oppression between mothers versus non-mothers? And this is sort of linked to Noe's comments that he made on what would be the difference between self-reproduction for mothers and versus non-mothers. So what needs to be done according to Patty's paper? There has to be a recognition in general of the attack on the standard of living of the working class, the well-being of the working class, in particular also the gendered and racialized forms of this attack on the standard of living on the working class. And most importantly, there has to be an increase in the struggle with the capitalist class so as to increase permanently the well-being of the working class. So these are my general summary and comments and few questions on Patty's paper. But overall, I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we'll have one last set of comments. And again, to the audience, please put any questions you have into the Q&A and the panelists will be able to see them. So the last set of comments is from Patty for Alicia's paper.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. I think the issue of violence is a really central issue in the oppression of women. I do wonder, however, whether the data on the increased reporting is because there's been an increase, which is definitely happens, or on a more positive side, because it is no longer considered as acceptable as it once was. And there is therefore maximum increased impression. Even the term femicide is new and should be, and is fantastically important. So I think this category of oppression is important. I actually think it has to be traced back to the pre-capitalist division of labor, in which the ruling class appropriated surplus not only from its own members, but through violence against other societies and military warfare that was carried out predominantly by men. That division of labor played a role in the normalization, if one wants to call it that, of violence by men. I think it has its historical roots. I do think that it's important, and I think Elaine and I agree on this, not to simply say that the time that women spent with their children is somehow a sign of inferiority. I really enjoyed the time I spent with my kids when they were growing up. And it was actually, I had to go into a full-time job when my second child was only 3 weeks old, and nobody should ever, ever, ever have to do that. To me, the time spent with my children was infinitely more rewarding to me than the job that I had as a college teacher. But that's another question. So again, the implication that somehow the division of labor that makes women carrying out more household labor rather than wage labor is necessarily a sign of oppression, I think really needs to be questioned. I'm not saying it can be, so that the isolation and the way in which it's carried out can be really important. So I think those are my two main comments. I think in terms of the labor spent in education, I think we need to be a lot more careful about what we mean by that. So that on the one hand, compulsory elementary and secondary education was motivated in large part by ideology. Education is also to improve the ability of capital to exploit laborers, so that on the other hand, the working class has always fought for education as a means of enhancing its own capabilities and welfare and so on. So I don't think we can just lump it all into that's childcare. Or that's a benefit for workers. It's more complicated. But I really think that this has been a fantastic panel, and I appreciate all of the contributions that everybody has made. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. So I want to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to the discussants, but also Professor Nina Banks has a comment. For the audience can't see it, so I'm just going to convey it. And I think it's an excellent comment, and perhaps all panelists, as you want, can respond. But she says, thanks for the presentations. And she's interested in what seems to be the absence of inclusion of discussions of race and ethnicity in the presentations, and how race and ethnicity have affected women's experience in care work, social reproduction, household work, and/or the ways in which racial oppression interacts with patriarchy and capitalism. So perhaps in your comments, you could address that and any other responses you may like. So I guess if we're going in order again, we'll start with Elaine.
Let's go over the question again. So within my work, I do not talk about race, but this is going to be a further development of my work. But definitely, my concern is not just about, the gendered nature of what I discuss as maternal economic oppression, of women's oppression, or of capability suppression, but my interest is more so on within gender. That is why I focus mainly on mothers, looking at women who are mothers and non-mothers. And definitely there would be some differences in the intensity of oppression that Black mothers might face versus white mothers or Latina mothers, or of the way in which Black mothers or Latina or white mothers or other races would experience maternal capability suppression. And these topics are very, subject matters are very important. But the emphasis of my work has been on within gender. Even if I were to work on race, I would look at within race differences amongst mothers. But definitely it's important.
Great. Do you have any, feel free to, we can discuss later if there's also people have anything they want to say in response to the discussants as well. So Noe and Catherine, do you have any comments?
Well, yeah, to address Nina Banks's comment, so thank you for that intervention. I think that's a really important piece of feedback, and something I also was kind of tracking as the session went on. I think in the case for our paper, this is something that I think that we should do. What we've tried to do is sort of look at a market economy in the absence of patriarchy or capitalism, and then sort of by omission also the absence of white supremacy or racial hierarchy. And then we layered on the patriarchy and the capitalist institutions. And I think what we need to do next is to layer on white supremacy or another way. And I think what I'm sort of grappling with based on reading and teaching I've been doing this past semester is exactly how I would want to do that. And I think one of the I mean, I could certainly see how racial hierarchy and racial oppression interacts with patriarchy and with capitalism. I can think a lot about that and how that creates further disadvantages. But then I think it would also, to give it equal treatment in our paper, would be something we would do also in isolation without patriarchy and without capitalism. And I have to think a little bit more carefully about that, but would of course welcome ideas or feedback. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Oh, and in response to Alicia's comments, thank you for those comments and apologies again for not being able to send you a paper ahead of time. I think your point about this being sort of specific, a specific way of looking at the problem that's based on a certain worldview and a certain time and place is very well taken. And I think we also probably should have done a better job of explaining that we're not describing actual historical conditions, right? These are abstractions sort of in this tradition of Smith and Ricardo and Marx. They're not sort of real case studies, although we have talked about bringing in some different case studies. And I think that would, bringing in some from different times and places and different levels of development and different colonial histories would also make the paper very interesting, perhaps very long, but it could certainly enrich the analysis. So thank you for that.
Okay, and Patty, do you have any responses?
Yeah, the repression that is inherent in all class societies is necessarily, I would argue necessarily, based on stratification. That it is not directed against all workers. It is directed in particular at workers who have been identified as a lower stratification, whether it's by race, by religion, by ethnicity, whatever. And then that combines with the assumption of superiority in the other group that then identifies with capital. So all repression has to be understood to take a stratified form. It's not as if, oh dear, there's repression. Oh, and by the way, it hurts Black people more. That's misreading how repression actually functions within a class society. So you know, that it's not a separate issue. It's how does class function? How does repression function? And without understanding that, you cannot even begin to talk about how you can form a unified struggle against oppression as a whole. So it is central to an understanding of any political movement. That's all.
Okay, and Alicia, do you have any responses either to the discussants or to this prompt from Dr. Banks?
Very short. Yes, I agree with Patty that violence is part of our culture. It comes from the pre-capitalist and you can see this violence in all our history. But the violence that we are living during the last decades, but especially during the COVID times, it is very important to see that this is very related to the public policy and especially the austerity policies. When you don't have employment and women are working, because in Latin America, women arrives to the labor market after all the International Monetary Fund policies at the end of the 70s and during the 80s and 90s. And so when women went to the labor market to increase the family income, it came a lot of violence in front of women, and also it has a lot of changes be inside the traditional family. But the form is that the cultural, we haven't had a better, or we haven't improved our culture to accept all these changes. So I think it is very important to see how all these austerity programs, or also the free trade agreement, the NAFTA agreement, and now the USMCA agreement, how they have changed the life of women, but also the violence. And it is very important to see that at least in Mexico, I'm going to, my opinion is from Mexico, is that we are sharing a criminal economy parallel to the official economy. And so that's why, and the problem is huge when all these austerity policies is taking a lot of the migration problem of Central America, but also from Venezuela and from Haiti, that are trying to arrive to USA, and they are in Mexico. It is terrible how the violence in front of these people, and especially of women, is being higher every time. So of course, violence has been in all our culture, is part of our culture. We have to stop that, but the violence that we are living right now is very related to the public policies, the austerity public policies that had been implemented by the authorization of the International Monetary Fund. For that, that will be my, and thank you very much for the comments, Patty, and all of you. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody. Yes, Elaine, yeah.
So I didn't respond to Nori's Nori's comments. Is it okay if I do that now? Okay. So there were a lot of comments which I really appreciate. I will respond to a couple of them, and then we can have a discussion later on the other ones I'm unable to respond to. So the first one I want to respond to is on the lack of clarity of the breadth of maternal economic oppression. I think in my presentation, I didn't even focus much on that, but in the paper, I acknowledge that I don't do a pretty good job in trying to make that more clear. So in terms of the breadth of maternal economic oppression, I'm looking at lower waged work, sort of triggering mothers who are engaged in a double day to engage in more work. So moonlighting, taking on multiple jobs. And in taking on multiple jobs, what happens is that there is a transfer of social reproduction to other members of the family. It could be grandparents, it could be younger children, it could be other women in other families. And most of the time, definitely these people who take on the responsibility are paid lesser than they would be paid if they were taking on these responsibilities professionally. So by the breadth of maternal economic oppression, I'm looking at the reach of capitals like oppressive nature beyond mothers. And you also talked about exploitation as uncompensated cost, that also not being clear. I think that in my work, I try to paint a picture of the unpaid nature of maternal labor itself as exploitative, but also the effect of that, the lack of payments in terms of what it generates, which is like the cost that it generates, and specifically the cost I put out there is the inability to engage in self-reproductive labor. And that moves into your next question of you saying that all labor is costly labor. So describing maternal labor as costly labor, what is the difference? The difference here is that the cost is the inability to self-reproduce, to engage in that human flourishing or various human flourishing activities, which mothers are unable to do as a result of, just caring for children and bearing for children. And the other question is, what is gained by adding self-reproduction to reproductive work? Because all of them could be lumped up together as reproductive work. What is gained here is a capability element in all of this presentation, and the emphasis on human flourishing. So by distinguishing reproductive labor from self-reproductive labor, what I'm putting out there is there needs to be some form of, activities that help the person to regenerate themselves. And that is lacking when we just lump all of them together and we lose sight of the specificities of the suppression and oppression that takes place if we lump them together. And even emphasizing on the essence of stratification by focusing on the lack of self-reproductive work between mothers and non-mothers, we are able to really hone in on what mothers are going through as a stratified group, as opposed to all women. So non-mothers and mothers, we just want to be more specific in terms of the intensity of the suppression and the intensity of the oppression that occurs within capitalist societies in the context of women. I think this will be my responses for now, and then we can talk later about the other comments that you made. But I really appreciate the informative comments you've given on my work. Thank you.
Great. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, so I just want to remind participants that that's how you can pose questions to our panelists. And I wanted to see if any of the panelists had any other questions they might have for any of the others. I have a question I've been thinking about, which is sort of related to Dr. Banks's question, and it comes out of this kind of nexus of like the empirical world and our theoretical world, sort of, and it has to do with the state. And it's like, if we have a variety of reasons to be quite skeptical of the state, either as a tool of white supremacy or military dictatorship, how do we think about the state as like our in the ask essentially? And I don't have a clear answer to this at all, so I'm just curious, how, if we problematize the state from a racialized or militarized view, then we're sort of left with thinking about community instead of the state. So anyway, these are just some thoughts that I have that I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts about them too. If you don't, it's fine. It's kind of just a question, but it seems to sort of come up in different, obviously the state is this sort of potential site for solution in some sense.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I've thought and written about this a little bit, particularly in a paper that I wrote about the British Factory Acts that's published in the CJE, which I'm happy to send you. Not so much the racialized piece, I also unfortunately abstract from that, but in terms of the state taking a role of sort of mitigating the conflict between capital accumulation and social reproduction, and how it can be sometimes useful for social reproduction, but ultimately it also plays a role in reproducing or ensuring the reproduction of capital accumulation, of capitalist relations, of patriarchal relations. And I think that certainly we have more than enough evidence of that being the case of racialized and racially oppressive institutions. So that's sort of one piece of it that I would go to. I think in the paper that we're developing, the sort of tricky part that we're coming to is that the stateless coordinated social reproduction is not obvious. It's not obvious to me. And I think that's sort of where I'm trying to get at. Okay, well, what does it mean if we're going to like abolish the state or abolish the family? how do we do that in a way that sort of ensures that society still functions and what is the guarantee that it functions in a way that is not oppressive of women and minorities? You know, how do we know that? We certainly haven't solved that problem, but I do see the sort of socially, I guess, sort of like in sum, I see the socially reproductive role of the state both taking a very important role in the reproduction of labor power, through ways that, you know, Patty talked about and the ways that we talk about, but also as a social reproducer of inequalities among race and gender lines. And that is certainly a role, and perhaps you could say even a project of, you know, the US state, and I would say the state in many other capitalist societies. So.
I'm going to call on Patty, but I'm also going to encourage y'all to look at the Q&A box. There's a couple of questions in there. Okay, Patty?
Yeah, I just start from the assumption, you know, there's reasons for it, that the capitalist state is primarily an institution of capitalist rule, which means that therefore it's an arena for struggle, as is the workplace, where you deal with the intensity of labor and so on. So it doesn't mean that somehow it just acts for capital. It has to mediate it and so on and so forth. But you know, I think the primary thing now is to work out how it functions. Now, I respect what Catherine is saying about what would it look like if we had another society. But I think our main task is to look at how it functions right now. And for that, I think you can't ignore its primary function as the maintenance of capitalism as a class system. That indeed involves, because I think the capitalist system does rely on both stratification and the oppression of women, and it therefore plays its role within that. But it can't be separated from any of those. So,
thanks. Do either Alicia, have you seen the comment in the Q&A box? I noticed that social protection expenditures were on the rise in Mexico. How can this increase in social protection be reconciled with an increase in violence, especially if making the argument that austerity policies may be correlated?
It's a comment, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's in the Q&A tab. There's the chat and then the Q&A tab. And the question to you is at the bottom there, a second question.
Oh, yes, I already see it. I did have.
Yeah.
Okay, a second question. I know this is
We have just a few minutes left, so.
Well, I think it's a huge problem, the violence, and I think that the state must, for me, as I see, is that you have to change your public policies. That's my answer.
Yeah.
And, because it is I will take more than 5 or 10 minutes to
Yes.
answer,
Yeah.
but thank you very much.
Yeah. And Catherine or Noe?
Sure, yeah, so I'll jump in. I appreciate this question, and actually just sort of by the by, this idea for this paper came about because we noticed a debate in the sort of classic domestic labor debate, one paper with Himmelett and Moen, the very famous paper, and another by Nancy Fulbray, 1983 paper, where this kind of question of like how efficient or is the household, and that's sort of where this began. But it's true, we are making this assumption, not that households do things inefficiently by any means, but that there are fixed costs of entering. And so that by definition, that limits the productivity gains. The scale of the household, for example, limits, and also the expertise and experience. So the idea isn't that like people are just dilly-dallying in their household and like taking as long as possible to make dinner, but that if you were cooking for a worker's cooperative kitchen, there would be some efficiency gains to that. but that those are also limited, right? You could maybe take care of 2 children as efficient, you know, with the same care as one, but not 30 with one adult if they're young children. So that's kind of where we're coming at. But I think clarifying that is an important piece of this, because our whole paper sort of hinges on that assumption.
I should just say this is one point of difference that I have with Catherine in terms of the historical development of commodity production as actually representing a reduction in the labor that's required for specific tasks carried out within the household. So I, far from seeing it as inefficient, I see capitalist production or commodity production as an efficient allocation of labor historically.
Sorry, will you say that again? Because I remember this piece that you say that but sorry, can you just say that again? Because yeah.
Okay. Commodity production is a form of replacement of the use values and requires less labor, and that is how it develops. Whether you're talking about increased food production or childcare or whatever, the whole historical process of commodity production can be read as a replacement of the use values produced within households of both the ruling class and the working class.
Yeah, and I think that doesn't necessarily contradict what we're saying in terms of, because we aren't saying necessarily the development story as much as.
Oh, but it has to be done historically. Oh.
I just want to say that we may get shut off here because by my watch, it's 2:14. I think the system may shut us off. So I encourage you all to continue these conversations. It's been a really excellent panel. I really appreciate it and I learned a lot. And I'm assuming that we will, I'm just looking at this. Assuming that we will see each other again at other sessions, but thanks so much to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.